Well, welcome to our panel on UnCivil Nation, Can a Divided Nation Stand? I'm Scott Walter. I'll be the moderator. I am the president of Capital Research Center, and also that means the proprietor of booth 806, so please visit the booth. I'll just very briefly give introductions to our guests here, though they don't really need introductions. First, we have Candace Owens. She burst onto the scene in 2017 as a YouTube star with Red Pill Black, promoting conservatism to black audiences. And she was so successful that Charlie Kirk hired her to be communications director for Turning Point USA. Next to me is John Fund, currently National Review's National Affairs reporter, and it's great to have conservatives who are actually reporters. Most of us tend to be opinionators, but a lot of us are old, and we can remember his decades of reporting at the Wall Street Journal, especially on foundations, a favorite topic of mine. He is, among other things, a co-author of Who's Counting, the best book ever written on vote fraud. And right after this panel, he'll be signing books at the books table in the exhibit hall. And then we also have Grover Norquist at the end, famous head of Americans for Tax Reform and the creator of the pledge that all good politicians take. Now, Grover went to Harvard twice. But we'll still let him on the panel. He is, after all, also a board member for the National Rifle Association and the American Conservative Union. So we'll have time for questions and answers before we finish this, but I want to let the panelists start. Grover, is it true that America today is notably divided?
Well, there are divisions if you compare it to other times in American history. During the Vietnam War, during the Civil War, going back to the Whiskey Rebellion, 1830s when South Carolina called out the militia because of the tariff bill. So there have been divisions and arguments, important ones, that could have torn the country apart. What we have now is the left, which was very happy with the norm of the previous 40 years, where the left would propose big government, and the Republicans would propose somewhat less than big government, so bigger, but not as big, and then we would compromise every day somewhere between much bigger and somewhat bigger, and the government would get bigger. And it would continue to get bigger at a faster or slower pace. And now there are elements in the modern Republican Party that suggest smaller, and that are opposing the inevitability of a Supreme Court whose job it is to move the country to the left, and say, actually, we need a Supreme Court to just read the Constitution and pay attention to what's there. These are violating the norms, what official Washington, what the establishment, what the left considered normal. And all of a sudden, we're not being normal because we've decided to, play tennis and not lose all the time. We win sometimes. And they're looking at the number of Republican states that are controlled by Republicans, both houses and the governor. They're looking at the Senate, up until recently the House, and the House could come back. They're looking at Trump winning, and they're going, we could lose this whole ball of wax. We could lose control of not only power, but the narrative and everything else. So the left is hysterical, and since they're so worked up, they announced that we're all worked up. So yeah, the establishment press, which reports on what's happening, tells us it's a terrible division and it's our fault because we quit losing so easily.
Well, now, Candace, Grover is arguing that we're not especially divided, but of course you've been in the middle of all kinds of rather loud fights that suggest divisions. Would you agree? Are we divided in a big, bad way or not?
We definitely are divided. Whether or not it's a unique division is up for debate, and I would argue, yes, it is. I think America has been separated in the past by ideological differences, but this is unique in that we have people that hate America. being at the forefront of our political system. I think that is in of itself unique. Very rare for a party to run on hating America and yet insisting that they want to be at the forefront of America. This is not something that's been done despite whether you were a Democrat or a Republican. You know, Barack Obama, for all of his flaws, and by the way, there were a ton of them, he never said he hated America. Right? He never said America is an awful, irredeemable country, or got on a stage and said that half of this country is, or more than half of this country is deplorable. You know, deplorable was actually the nicer word that Hillary Clinton used. Irredeemable was what she said before it, and it was worse. So I think that's unique. And then I think separately, never have we been at the center of the left losing a stranglehold on the race debate. And that is unique. And that's why I find myself in the fire all the time, because I've kind of forced this necessary conversation about how it's possible that the people that have harmed Black Americans and Latino Americans the most somehow have had our vote for the last 6 decades.
Well, John, obviously there are some divisions in America. What do you think are some of the things that are driving the divisions that do exist?
Well, I think both Grover and Candace have touched on them. I would say in previous times where we've been at peace, not the Civil War, not Vietnam War, which had riots in the streets, and certainly not other periods of time, this is the most divisive when we're largely at peace. The reason I think is, touching on what Grover said, until about the 1970s or 1980s, almost both political parties in the major sense wanted to transmit American values to the next generation. They disagreed around the edges about what they should be, but there was fundamental agreement that the American experiment was good, moral, worthy of emulation, worthy of carrying it out to the rest of the world as an example, beacons of liberty. And there was broad agreement that America was exceptional and a good thing. Then the left, powered by all the forces that you've heard about at this conference, decided that rather than transmit American values, we were going to transform America. Remember Barack Obama, 5 days before the 2008 election, said, "We are only a few days away from fundamentally transforming this country." That kind of rhetoric would never have been uttered by another candidate in years past. He wanted to transform America. The Republican Congress and the Tea Party stopped him from doing that, but he wanted to. And John Fonte at the Hudson Institute has gone into a long list of the divisions in this country based on vocabulary, and I'm going to be borrowing from him and when I come back in the next round here, of how we used to talk about America, citizenship, equality, freedom of opportunity, and how the left now talks about it. Two different vocabularies, polarized country, and it's all about power. They want to seize power, and as Grover says, they're worried that they're going to lose the argument with America. They're going to lose the argument with the American people. And by the way, you know, I've been on cable television for almost 25 years now. The fundamental difference in cable television since I started is they used to want to debate us. Liberals used to come on and there'd be actual conflict. Now, they don't want to debate. They just want to say hate speech, hate speech, hate speech. They want to shut people like Candace down. And that shows their fundamental weakness and insecurity. They have a lot of power and a lot of strength, but they're also fundamentally insecure because in their heart of hearts, they know they're not with the majority of the American people.
Well, Grover, John is saying how they're weak, and I think you're quite right about that, John, that there's a guilt complex. It's in the back of their heads there that, God forbid, somebody hear Candace. I mean, if you were all wrong, it should be safe, right? You should make a fool of yourself, and there's no problem, and they'll win. But at the same time, of course, I want to talk for a second about their power, because I think that does help to drive some of the conflict here. Grover, you know, would you say that, or in your opening remarks, you made the point about how the left has managed to get government bigger and bigger and bigger. And there's another aspect of that. It's also more and more centralized. So more and more decisions made in Washington, D.C. The courts, which are unappealable, essentially, having more and more say on issue after issue. Is that kind of centralization of power worsening conflict in America?
Well, in a sense it is, because there is now a sort of conservative majority in the Supreme Court. So the left, which wanted to put every decision into the Supreme Court, is now trying to decide how to avoid having issues go to the Supreme Court. Since 1994, 18 of 24 years, the Republicans have had the House and the Senate, 2/3 of the time. Before that, the Republicans in the previous 60 years had the House and the Senate for 4 years, 1 out of 15 years, not 2 out of 3. And they see this swing, so they don't want as much being decided by Washington, D.C. If it could be decided by the bureaucracy, they still own that. But they don't own the presidency. They lost the presidency first. I mean, Eisenhower, Nixon, they lost the presidency often, which is why they put the power in Congress and the courts. And every time conservatives, libertarians begin to make any progress in a particular zone, as soon as this election 2016 was over, they announced this country will now be governed, said Bloomberg, by mayors, because they owned all the big city mayors and they were going to run things through the mayors. That's why they love to throw ideas to the United Nations, because then we really don't have a lot of clout when it comes up, to decide what to do. So they play this game of, moving the power to the zone that they control. That's why they want a lot of decisions made in universities, and which they're under fairly good control. The media should control debates because they have pretty good control of the media. So, but they've been losing various spheres that matter. State governments matter. State governments trump cities. State governments can preempt cities from having certain taxes, passing certain laws, and they've been very busy doing that with red states and blue cities, saying that's very nice, you can't do the following 20 things because we don't want you messing around. I think that the yelling and the shouting comes from the left having a sense that they're losing, and the nastiness and the reduced identity politics, because they can't argue economics. They used to believe that they were better at economic job creation than we were. The first recession the United States government ever tried to fix is the one that lasted more than 10 years. The one in 21 that they didn't do anything with was over in 18 months. But the one they got their hands on, and Hoover and FDR, again, bipartisan agreement on big government fix for a recession. We didn't pull out of that in terms of the stock market till the 50s, and unemployment till 9 years in. So they can't argue they can handle the economy well. So they've got to go to other issues, pay no attention to how poorly the economy in your neighborhood's doing. The Republicans don't like you. Vote for us.
That's correct.
Well, as we say, there really are divisions going on, and they're not small, as John rightly says. Candace, what do you think are some of the things that could be done to lessen the divisions? One thing that's often thrown out, especially toward our side, is that the rhetoric needs to be much milder. Do you think that's a good avenue, or what would be a good avenue?
I can answer this in a couple of ways. So first and foremost, I always want to assert myself as someone that is not interested in solving the division in this country. When we're talking about communism versus capitalism, there is no middle ground. One side must win, okay? And I hear this word over and over again, good, right? What we're really seeing happen in this country, and it's very important for people to understand this. It is a war versus truth versus goodness. The left is on a path that they are pursuing goodness, and what is problematic about goodness is that there is no definition of goodness, right? It's up to the human brain to decide what's good. It sounds good, but the truth is that when you start pursuing goodness, you can end up with really bad results. Of course, it sounds good to say that we should have welfare policies so Black America can get off of their feet after years of segregation and Jim Crow laws. Okay, it sounded good, so that's why we voted all of these things into existence after the Civil Rights Act in 1964. But what are the results of that? What is the truth regarding these welfare policies? It's negatively impacted Black America. It's hurt us. Affirmative action, that sounds good. Black Americans, let's wave a magic wand and put Black Americans in schools that they should not be in based on their results. But what is the result of doing something like affirmative action? That pursuit of goodness leads to a really bad truth, which is that a percentage of us are dropping out of school, not finishing, because we've been educationally mismatched with universities that we had no businesses being in there. The truth is that there is no substitute for hard work, and people don't like the truth. This is their problem with Donald Trump. Donald Trump represents truth meeting goodness. He has catalyzed that war between truth and goodness. He has exposed these people as the cockroaches that they are, and they are all running from the light.
So I think that's
Tell us what you really think.
Yeah, that gives us an answer on the whether milder rhetoric is the main way to do it. What about you, John? The lessening our divisions, is there a good way that we should be trying to lessen our divisions?
Well, sometimes on television I feel like a dinosaur because I'm from a previous era where relative civility applied. I remember the first time I was accused of racism on national television. And I just sort of was slack-jawed and looked at the opposing fellow, Jason Epstein, and said, "Is that all you got?" That's a substitute for thought. And then I said, look, I'm going to warn all my friends on the left. If you misinterpret the definition of racism and you apply it to anything that you don't like, anything that's remotely critical of anybody who happens to have a slightly different skin pigmentation or whatever, and then you extend it to sexism and homophobia and everything else, if you make such blanket denunciations rather than actually debate the issues, we're not going to end up in a good place. Because like a rubber band that is stretched all the way back under pressure and tension, it's going to snap back at you. And that snapback is Donald Trump. And I'm not here to defend everything Donald Trump says or does. I have problems with some of it. I think some of it is unnecessary. Even the president acknowledged that today after he talked about the rally in North Carolina. But this was an inevitable consequence of 30 years of basically a form of hate speech against conservatives, accusing us of ill motives without even talking to us. What really drives me crazy is when people think they know what's in my heart or in Candace's heart or in Grover's heart or in your heart without even having a scintilla of conversation or even discussion. We have a lot of things in common. We've seen in criminal justice reform, we've seen in corporate welfare, we've seen in a range of areas. There can be potential agreement. But there is an element of the left, a large element of the left, unfortunately a dominant element of the left, that simply wants to search and destroy. And until we call that out, and until we extirpate that from the political conversation, we're not going back to situation normal.
Yes, Grover.
Yeah, on the question of where you can have left-right agreement, I am not in favor of bipartisan compromise because that's when Republicans and Democrats get together and express their class interests as politicians against the rest of the people. They give themselves more power, more money, better pensions, and so on, fight term limits. But what we can have is principled men and women of the right and left for different reasons doing the same thing. And then neither of them said, okay, I'm going to do this. I really hate half of this, but I'm going to do it for some, I like pepperoni, and this is pepperoni in shards of glass, so okay, we'll call it a deal. You don't want each of the present mess we're in was that kind of bipartisan compromise. Republicans and Democrats would get together and come up with something that was both stupid and evil and call it progress. But when we did criminal justice reform, or began to do it, there were questions. My office got to stop calling. There were real opportunities. Both people on the right and left said there are too many people in prison for too many laws, and we need to reduce the number of laws, crimes, the 600,000 federal regulations that can put you in jail. You've probably not read all of them. And the left has their own theory about mass incarceration. And so the agreement we came to reduced the number of people in prison, for how long, and for the number of crimes, and took some different approaches. And both the right and the left could say, I am happy with what we just did. Now, each one would have said, I wish there was a different amount of the Venn diagram that we could have agreed on. You know, we wanted civil justice reform. We wanted, you know, the mens rea fixed. I mean, all sorts of things. But what we did was we agreed on it. Term limits was one that right and left could agree on.
We used to.
Well, the least successful press conference I ever participated in was with Ralph Nader and myself 2 weeks before 14 states passed term limits with an average vote of 75%. Not a single press person in Washington, D.C. came to a press conference about what became a landslide just a couple weeks later. And it took the New York Times 2 weeks to actually put into the bomber section of the newspaper, B23 or something, that there'd been this election, and they sort of put it in a little box. It would have been front page if it had been something they'd in favor of. But again, Ralph Nader thinks if more people, there was more turnover, more liberals would win. I tend to think more limited government people would win. Transparency is another one, where everything a state or city or the federal government does, every spending, every contract, online. Ralph Nader's under the impression if everyone saw how their money was spent by the government, hey, Martha, look at how well they're spending our money. We should send them more. I tend to think it might go a different direction. But on the right and the left, and we can beat the mushy middle because they never know quite what's going on. And there are a series of these issues where we can get together on specific issues. But all the R's and all the D's getting together and cutting and splitting the difference, that's called losing.
Yes. What Grover said is very important. You mentioned my book on voter fraud. The Washington Post poll a couple of years ago asked one of the questions on voter fraud as follows. Do you believe this is a very serious problem on down the line? A greater percentage of actual African Americans, Hispanics, and Asians thought it was a bigger problem than Caucasians. Why? Let me tell you the horrible, dirty little secret of voter fraud. They claim there is no voter fraud. Let me tell you right now, the biggest victims of voter fraud in this country are minority residents of inner cities and poor, neglected rural areas that want good roads, good schools, decent public services, honest government, and machines run by people from either their own ethnic background or from still the white power structure, oppress them and make sure that any reformers who rise up, even if they get as far as an election and a ballot, they're going to steal the election. Whether it's Greene County, Alabama, or Kansas City, or Milwaukee, or Detroit. You know, Detroit was a mayor a few years ago named Kwame Kilpatrick. He was so corrupt that until very recently, he was serving in public housing and stripes. There was an election. He lost the first round, the runoff, mysteriously 9,000 absentee ballots show up. He wins the election against a reform African-American named Freeman Dyson. It was clear it was stolen. You could not get anyone in the media to report on this in depth. Finally, months later, it was shown that there was such manifest incompetence and fraud. The city clerk of Detroit had to be removed from office. She refused. She had to be literally carried out in her chair from the office by sheriff's deputies. I'm here to tell you, when they say there is no voter fraud, they are covering up the scandal of the century, the unreported scandal of the century, that they keep the control of these big city machines Grover mentions because they steal these elections, and it's minorities who notice this because they actually live in these places, and that's why the Washington Post survey turned out the way it did.
And that's why the Washington Post hasn't said a lot about it.
It was only in the fine print of the subtabs. Yeah. They never reported it in the main article.
Exactly. Well, that actually brings up an interesting aspect of this. So we've all been attacking the left side of the spectrum, and Lord knows identity politics and big government, many things that they have that have made division in America worse. But maybe we should turn the telescope on ourselves for a second. You know, conservatives and libertarians have not done a good enough job, I would argue, at going into America's cities, which are the only place the left has other than some college towns, right? It's the big city, little blue islands in the Sea of Red. That's where the left's power base is, and that's also where people really are suffering. I mean, it's not like there's not a problem in America with poor blacks, poor Hispanics, poor, Laotians, in fact, in San Francisco area and all. So would it make a difference to the divisiveness in America if conservatives and libertarians did a better job going into cities and talking about how we are not responsible for your suffering and we have ideas that will make it better? Candace?
I would say easier said than done. I've realized that many Republicans suffer from PTSD, 60 years of being called a racist, and they're just, you know what, hands off. Every time they try to help or they say something, they're told that what they're trying to do is racist, and I can understand that and sympathize with that, because I get called a white supremacist, so I can't even imagine. I can't even imagine what Republicans have heard about themselves for just trying to help people. But I think we are uniquely positioned now for conservatives and Republicans to go into these inner cities, because the conversation has at long last been cracked in Black America. And I think a great example of that is look at what Ron DeSantis was able to do in Florida. I mean, he barely won, but he won because he took a message to Black women about their children and school choice. And since our communities are so destroyed and so many people are growing up in single parent homes in the Black community, the matriarch of the family is so important. And what the matriarch cares about is her children. So him being able to use just that argument, go in and speak to them, made a difference in his election. We have to, I think, as Republicans, you guys are going to have to get over the PTSD and say, I'm ready to go into these neighborhoods. I'm willing to have these conversations. How can I help? And the time is definitely now, because we have a president that's a truth teller. So people are more primed and the ground is more fertilized for people to hear the truth.
You know, Candace is right. 25 years ago, there was a Senate race between an old, frankly, fairly conservative Democrat named Bob Kruger against K. Billy Hutchison in Texas. This was the first big special election under Bill Clinton. K. Billy Hutchison won that election, but she had to endure feminists, including Gloria Steinem, who accused her of being a female impersonator. In other words, it doesn't matter if you're Black or female or gay or anything. You aren't an authentic representative of the left-wing power structure, therefore you might as well be invisible, or you're a collaborator or Uncle Tom or whatever it is. By the way, you know, it goes everywhere. So I think that what we need to do is fight back, especially with folks, people like Candace and others, who will literally say, are you serious? I think we have to not get angry at these people. I think we have to ridicule and use satire. We can't take them seriously. So the PTSD that she mentions, we just simply have to start laughing at them. Do you got anything else? Is this it? This is your excuse for a debate?
I'm going to let Grover jump in here in a second, but I want to ask folks, there are microphones that you can start lining up behind if you want to ask our fascinating panel questions here. But Grover?
Yeah. It's extremely important to do outreach, and by that I mean just showing up, because the left's argument is not we do all this great stuff for you, it's they hate you. And as soon as you show up and say hi and sit in the back of the church and just be there, well, then you ruin half of their argument, that they hate you. They don't say you should hate them, they say they hate you. And if you don't show up and just make that not true, it can hurt. There was some wonderful advertising that some people did into the African-American community on school choice, sponsored by the Republican Party, and they ran this a couple months before an election. And the Democratic leadership accused Republicans of vote suppression because since you've been running ads and saying we're the Republican Party and we think school choice is a good idea and we think you might too, you were making the Republicans not scary. And when 3 weeks before the election they came out and said the Republicans want to eat you and burn crosses on your lawn and they're just off, it didn't bring out the vote. It was vote suppression. The vote was lower than before because people weren't terrified by these Republicans when the Democrats said boo, because we had, at least on radio, been talking to people. So it interestingly kept their scare tactics from working, but if we did it in person, it would be, and regularly, and not just from time to time. Alan Keyes told me he was going to go win because he was going to go to the 300 conservative Black churches in Maryland. And I said, Alan, you do know there are only 45 Sundays between now and the election. This was a much better strategy 6 years ago. So you have to plan ahead and be there and be there and be there and be there.
Yeah. Well, I will give a plug for somebody else's book, Tim Carney's new book, Alienated America, Why Some Places Flourish and Others Fail, is wonderful on this sort of thing Grover's talking about, that civil society, which is to say the churches, the pool halls, the coffee shops, the things that really make up people's neighborhoods, especially in cities, are enormously important. They're the foundation of the resistance to government. I mean, if it can't just be the individual and the state, because the state's going to win that fight. It's the things in between.
And where Donald Trump was absolutely right is, you know, we talk sometimes in racial terms about who's suffering in America, and that's understandable, but what had happened for the last 20 or 30 years on a bipartisan basis was we forgot that irrespective of color, a lot of white people had been forgotten and had been cast aside, and their concerns had not been heard. And that combined with Donald Trump's, I think, call for the fact that, you know, a rising tide does lift all boats, that, I think, boosted Trump in several communities. Remember, Donald Trump did better among Hispanics than Mitt Romney did. There's a reason for that. I believe that the single most powerful message that Donald Trump is going to have to people who have been left behind is in 2020, he's going to be able to say, pointing to historic unemployment rates among all groups, are you better off now than you were 4 years ago?
Right.
We all know what the answer will be next year.
And the polls show that. Just to jump in really quickly to wrap up, the polls show that. So I'm super optimistic about 2020 because the left has completely overplayed their hand. I mean, I don't know about you guys, but I'm so desensitized to the word racist at this moment. I mean, everything is racist. The Washington Post ran an article saying that air was racist. Air. Like, literally, oxygen is racist, and it's targeting inner city communities, bad oxygen.
Well, it's colorless, therefore it has to be.
Yeah, exactly. And so what you have, as humorous as it is that they're overplaying their hand, and it's becoming like The Boy Who Cried Wolf, where even if there was racism, we wouldn't even be able to see it because they've called so many people and things racist. And you're seeing that despite them saying racist, I think in the last few weeks, 2,200 times on CNN.
Oh, really?
Black American support for Donald Trump, even by polls conducted by the enemies, NAACP, has doubled since he stepped foot into office. So they're in bad shape right now.
One analogy is when one is in junior high school and you're 12 or 13, everything becomes a sexual innuendo. Every word, everything. Aha, that means this, right? And it's like that. And the Democrats on the left right now, everything becomes the racist thing, and they try to go. They use their own theory of the universe, but you said X, and then they figure out how to say, see, that means it's race. They're like the 12 and 13-year-olds, and they're putting as much thought into it, and they just obsess themselves, and they assume everybody else is at the same time. And the sad thing is they won't grow out of it.
And the truth is, the reason why you have kids that are doing that with the sexual innuendos is because they're obsessed with sex.
Yes.
Same to the Democrats. They are the actual racists, so go figure why they are running around calling everybody else.
If you look up in psychology textbooks projection, you accuse the other side of what you yourself know you're doing. Well, and believe me, their entire effort is a form of projection.
Saul Alinsky's rules for radicals.
Well, I can't resist jumping in here on one point, which is one of the things my think tank studies is the Southern Poverty Law Center, which is wonderful at finding sexism under every rock and leaf. And then we discover that actually they're viciously sexist and racist in their own building.
I wouldn't, again, we don't want to do that. Let's just say highly discriminatory.
There you go. Well, but my point is, I think the way the psychology works, there are hundreds of people who work there. So let's say you're just some poor schlub who got hired to write the direct mail craziness that they send out and make their hundreds of millions off of. And you see all this around you at the SPLC. Well, my God, think what it must be like at the Heritage Foundation. But anyway, it's time for us to let some other folks have a chance. So over here.
Well, hello. Senator Eric Brakey from Maine, actually running for Congress in northern Maine. But a question for you. As we're seeing this moment, our politics becoming increasingly tribal polarized, each side fighting for power over the central authority in Washington, D.C. to impose its ways of life on everyone. You hear murmurings more and more. You hear California talking about breaking up into 5 states to get away from each other. You hear California talking about breaking off completely from the union. These are, I think, things that are talked about humorously at this moment. But the fact that they're even being talked about makes me wonder, and I'm curious for your thoughts. going forward, if this trend continues, if this polarization continues, do you think that within the next 10, 20 years, secession is going to be looked more seriously as a solution to these problems?
Let me be very blunt. We've been in a situation for the last 40 years, both parties have been in approximately equal success. Normally in American politics, one party dominates, and then for a while till they fail and another party dominates. We have to win. And if we win for 10, 15, 20 years across the board that Grover mentioned, then we can have a serious discussion with them about, gee, maybe it would be wise for you to go back to federalism, a true federalist view of limiting Washington's power, because guess what? The people you don't like have seem to be running Washington a lot. And that's the only thing that they will listen to. And you pass laws paring back the government, paring back the administrative state, paring back the arbitrary abuse of our civil liberties, and that includes, by the way, bipartisan abuse. Just look at the NSA, whether it's spying on Donald Trump's campaign or whether it's spying on ordinary Americans. Then you can have a conversation. But first, before you have that conversation, the way to get rid of that silly rhetoric is to have to win, and that's what we have to do first.
Yep. On this side.
Love you, Candace. Any chance of seeing you debate AOC?
I'm sorry, what?
The question was, any chance of Candace debating AOC?
For those of you that follow me, you know I have tried. I had a donor that said that they would write a $100,000 check to whoever she wanted the check written to if she would debate me, and she declined to do so. That's what happens when you don't actually believe the things that come out of your mouth. You refuse to debate your ideas. AOC believes nothing that she's saying, and she refuses to get on the stage, not even just with me, with anyone. I stepped up because Ben Shapiro offered to debate her, and she replied by, doing her thing where she says, scary white men coming after me, and she tried to make it seem like this was some creepy pass, because Ben Shapiro really makes creepy debate passes at people. And I said, all right, well, let's get past that hump, and why don't you debate a minority woman? So we cannot talk about racism or sexism. Let's actually hear your ideas, because your ideas are awful, and you don't actually believe anything that you're saying.
Look, I live in New York, and I actually covered AOC in that primary before she won and became a celebrity. I'll slightly disagree with Candace. I think she does believe much of what she says. I think she's sincerely deluded. But the reason why her allies will not let her debate anyone of substance is that William F. Buckley, founder of National Review, famously said when Robert Kennedy wouldn't debate him, he was asked, why do you think that's the case? And Buckley said, why does baloney reject the grinder? And I think the reason why AOC would not debate Candace or Ben Shapiro is that simple. They are insecure in their intellectual foundations, which is why they hurl insults and empty rhetoric so frequently.
Yep. This side.
Thank you for being here. Your platforms are so large, and you're able to be seen by so many people. I'm just a homeschool mom from Arizona, but I want to know what I can do. Thank you. I want to know what I can do on my micro level to heal division, if there is division. I'm a little gun shy, like you said. I think I have a little PTSD. So what can I do in my own little world to bridge some of these gaps that may be there? And I hope I can see them if they are. Thank you.
I would first and foremost say is never discount what you can provide. Think about this: in the midst of all wars, everybody fights in a different way, right? There are the fighters, there are the writers, there are the financiers of war. So we're all contributing in different ways. Not everybody is like me and wants to go on the front lines and take a bunch of bullets, go back home, patch up, and go back on the front lines. But remember, I started on YouTube. I just put my ideas out there. And then when people started giving me feedback, I got together a community of people. There are so many people on the internet right now that are looking for somebody to just organize. And what you're talking about on the local level, being able to organize and have people know that they're not alone. What I realized with Black America is that there were so many people that were conservative curious, and there was never somebody out there on the front line saying, no, it's okay, you can experiment with conservatism and see what you, see what you come up with. And then beyond that, I said, okay, okay, I also need to create little communities. So when you reach out to these people and they say, yeah, I think this, but this is what I need, or this is, hey, why don't you come to a FreedomFest, event? Hey, why don't I sponsor you to come to DC for the first time? When we held an event and I brought 500 black kids to the White House, these were kids that weren't really sure what they believed in ideologically. Their parents definitely were against Trump. We found donor matches for each of them and sponsored their trips to come. It was the first time they had ever been on a plane. It was the first time some of them had ever been on a train. They had never left their own neighborhoods. If you want to know why the Democrats are so able to create Plato's allegory of the cave, which is what I think they're doing to Black America, they don't know a reality that exists outside of what they've seen every day. And what they've seen every day is their own distressed neighborhoods and CNN explaining it away as racist white Republicans. Reach out, whether it's you want to reach out to people that are all conservatives or minority conservatives and add a helping hand. You'll be surprised at how much you can do by organizing on the community level.
The question is from Arizona. Arizona is one of the most successful states in the country on school choice. They've had a successful educational tax credit for almost 25 years. There are a lot of success stories that need to be told. There's a lot of work that can be done in getting the story of school choice out to people in neighborhoods that need it, but have been subject to teacher union propaganda about it. The most effective thing you can do is still to act locally. And
Absolutely.
You often get the most satisfaction from acting locally with people you can touch and feel and interact with. And I strongly urge a lot of people, yes, of course national politics is important, but if you want to make a real difference, act locally.
I agree.
Yep, that's very much what one learns from Tim Carney's Alienated America book. And he has some great ideas at the end of the book, small things you can do locally to start building things. And by the way, little things like that in America, because we're such geniuses at this kind of association that Tocqueville praised us for 150 years ago, some guy in a church basement started something called the Knights of Columbus that now has tens of thousands of members in every city and county in America.
AA started in a church basement.
Yeah, AA, exactly, worldwide. So you never know how far you'll go. Let's see, it's this side's turn.
Hi, thank you. I'm a conservative Hispanic and from California. And the thought is, we don't exist, and that's not true. And I almost feel like the Republican Party, the Conservative Party, ignores California for those huge votes that are out there. I mean, we could have a huge impact in the elections, but I don't see the current administration making an effort to see us, to motivate us, to guide us, to help us. And I feel like we get ignored, and they just say, well, the stats show you're a Democrat, forget it. So I would like to ask you, what can you do to help us in California have more of a presence?
I can jump in. You want to say something?
Sure. It's very difficult to get people in other states to focus on your state. I don't mean just California, but any state. Getting to the local stuff, we really got to start this up from California. There are a couple of congressional districts that can be won, and focus on those to begin with. If you're the guy allocating dollars for television, how many do you put in Wisconsin and Michigan, and how many do you put in California? It's just awfully difficult to ask them to make those trade-offs in a presidential race. Day to day, all the time. I wish the president would spend more time in California with Hispanic Americans, because you want to do that for 4 years before the election. When you get too close to the election, it's all about the Electoral College votes, and it's tough to do community networking and building with 2 months to go. Now it's important. It gets tougher and tougher to begin as you get closer to an election. So a lot of this is on your shoulder and your friends' shoulders to work the community there, and there are opportunities. There's some House races, there's state legislative races. You may not be able to win the presidency in California right now, but you can win those other races.
What Prop 13 is under assault in California? In 2020, that pioneer tax cutting initiative will be threatened by a left-wing ballot measure. If you can help organize Hispanics to save Prop 13, you will get much more attention than you expect, because lots of people in California are in their homes, over 75%. This is a direct ultimate threat to them. They may be going after business property now, but your property is next. That's one way you can make a difference and be heard. Attach yourself to a supremely important issue and say the opposition to this is everyone, including Hispanics.
And I also I want to first and foremost just validate what you're saying. You're absolutely right. I've been frustrated myself when you talk to people. There seems to be this, well, forget about California. They're already lost because it's infested with liberalism, and that is the liberal experiment, and we're seeing that it fails in California. But you don't always have to look at a national level or a federal level for validation. You don't always have to look to the Trump campaign. The first Blexit rally that I did was in LA. The Hispanics came out in scores. It was a sold-out rally. It was awesome. Blexit is my movement. Black and Latinos exiting the Democrat Party, and we had a great time. And we talked about just exactly this thing. How do we mobilize on the local level and create a movement that's happening and plug in with one another? So I would say I always try to discourage people from thinking that they don't exist unless the federal government recognizes them. You exist. You're in California. You're here. You're feeling impassioned. Take that passion to the next level and mobilize.
Great. This side.
First of all, Candace, you're terrific.
Thank you so much.
Lovely. I am very, very disturbed with feelings and being offended, and the silent majority stays silent. And I can make a whole list of things that are wrong, absolutely wrong, and should be erased. When are we ever going to see consequences and some jail sentences?
Grover?
Grover?
Well, when people throw rocks through windows in D.C. when the president was inaugurated, and then they decide they really can't put anyone in jail for that with the amount of damage to cars and property, that's a breakdown in the rule of law in the city of D.C. People should have gone to prison for that. The left wants to put people in prison for saying things they don't like, but when you cross the line, as the Antifa fascist guys do, and hurt people and hit people and destroy property, that's not part of a free speech. That is the opposite of free speech, and really there should be people put in prison there. And if cities won't do that, the federal government ought to be saying we're not funding cities that don't do it, just as the federal government stepped in when states wouldn't protect civil rights in the South, and they sent in troops. The line has to be drawn at violence, and it's a sense of how badly the left thinks they're doing that they're reduced to that. So it's sort of a cheerful sign, but it's not cheerful if you're the guy getting hit.
Black masked Antifa violence, which my sister in Portland has witnessed, is one thing. There's also white-collar deep state crime in Washington. And we're going to have an Inspector General's report, finally, from the Justice Department, from an Inspector General appointed by Barack Obama soon. We're also going to have internal investigations that Attorney General Barr has initiated. In the next 4 to 6 months, we're going to have a pretty good idea of how the email scandal was hijacked and downplayed, and how lots of people got off scot-free in the email scandal with Hillary, and the deep state attempt to subvert the 2016 election. Look, I'm not a conspiracy theorist, and some of the wildest stuff you read on the internet isn't true. You got to go to reliable sources. But there was something going on, both with the email scandal and with the 2016 Trump campaign. When those people are found to have testified under oath falsely, or committed perjury when being interviewed by federal investigators, all we see on CNN and MSNBC is these people have to be prosecuted, these people have to be prosecuted. Well, if the proof is finally found on the other side, we'll see what they start saying. I think those people should be prosecuted, and I think some of them will be.
Hi, great session. Thank you for being here. My name is Smiley. I'm from California.
Could you speak up?
Yeah, I'm sorry. Could you speak up a touch?
Okay. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
All right. Thank you for being here. Great session. My name is Smiley. I'm from California. Question for you. We're in an information war right now in this generation. We hear fake news from all sides. You just mentioned right now going to reputable sources. How do we find and how do we find the right sources to trust in this day and age where there's always a new story? Who do we believe?
Well, you start by turning off CNN. That would be the first thing that I would do. These far left propaganda funded sites, I mean, people ask me this question all the time, like, where do you get your information from? And the truth is that I don't read just one news source. And I also like to read international news coverage to see what people are saying. And unfortunately, it takes a longer process. And we live in this generation where people are so impatient. We've got Instagram, we've got Facebook, we've got the scrolling effect. And kids don't have the attention span to actually go pursue data and to go look at documents or go to look at FBI statistics and things of that nature. So it's incredibly tricky. But I actually think that what's been very helpful, and you might completely disagree with this, is that we're no longer in a society, way of looking at it optimistically, we're no longer in a society where it's just CNN and Fox News competing to give us information. The birth of alternative media sources has been extremely healthy for us. In fact, I think, and so many people say, I just wish Trump would stop tweeting. I say, what a blessing he did tweet, or he wouldn't be in office. He got away from the mainstream media narrative and was able to go directly to the American people. So the way to do this, I guess, is you have to remain wide. You have to look at, you do in fact have to see some of the lunacy of what they're saying and then be able to go and debunk and look at statistics like I do. But I wouldn't rely on the younger generation to do that.
Very, very quickly, I would make one suggestion. I've never taken a penny from this group. Real Clear Politics is a darn good way to follow both the responsible debate on the left and the responsible debate on the right. There's also Real Clear Policy and a whole bunch of related sites. Candace is absolutely right, but I'll also add to what she said. Every one of you can be your own publisher. Every one of you has an email list of hundreds, friends, neighbors, relatives, colleagues at work. Send them stuff with your own commentary attached to it. The believability of something you send to someone you know is so much higher. There's, on a scale of 1 to 100, the average political ad in terms of trust, with 0 being complete fabrication and 100 being the gospel truth, the average political ad is at a 25. If you send something to a friend, neighbor, relative, or colleague at work, it's at 65 to 80% believability. You have the power to be your own publisher with the people you know. And lastly, if you want any other suggestions for what websites to go, I'll be in the exhibit hall right after this signing books, and I'm happy to, because we're running out of time, I'm happy to give you suggestions of where to look.
And I have to give an endorsement for our site, influencewatch.org, which is an online encyclopedia of the left. So if you want to know about Soros and Antifa, Black Lives Matter and the rest, that's a great source.
But
we are
the website again?
Influencewatch.org. Okay. And about over 8,000 entries of left-wing donors, activist groups, and the rest. But I just want to ask you to please help me thank our wonderful panel because our time is up.
Thank you.
That was well done.